In this tutorial, we'll be looking at the concept of expected return. The expected return of an investment is basically the average return on that investment. So if you have an investment, let's call it an investment A. An investment A can either give you 200 Rand or it can give you 100 Rand. What is the expected return on investment A? Without any more information, what we do is that we take the 200 Rand, we'd add it to the 100 Rand, we divide this by 2, and it would give us an expected return of 150 Rand. We call this the simple average. The simple average is appropriate in a situation like this where the assumption is that the return of 200 Rand and the return of 100 Rand are both equally likely to occur. In a situation where the likelihood of the outcomes is not equal, then you need to take into account the probability of each outcome. Let's say the probability of obtaining a return of 200 Rand was 30%, and the probability of achieving an outcome or return of 100 Rand was 70%. In this situation then, in order to calculate the expected return, you would add up the weighted returns of investment A. So there is a 30% probability of achieving 200 Rand. So that amounts to 60 Rand. And there's a 70% probability of achieving 100 Rand, and that amounts to 70 Rand. So the expected return when the likelihood of occurrence is not the same would be the 60 Rand plus the 70 Rand, and this gives you 130 Rand. We call this the weighted average. This is the way in which to calculate the expected return if you've got the probability of occurrence. But sometimes you don't have the probability of occurrence. Let's consider an example. Let's say you've got a portfolio, and in that portfolio, you've got assets A and B. Asset A has got a return of 15%. Asset B has a return of 100%. Now let's say that the investment in asset A is 100,000 Rand. The investment in asset B is only 20,000 Rand. How would you work out the expected return of this portfolio, which consists of both asset A and asset B? You cannot take the expected return of asset A, which is 15%, and add it to the expected return of asset B, which is 100%, and divide it by 2. You can only ever do that if the weights of your investment in A and your investment in B are equal. But here, the weights are not equal. 100,000 Rand has been invested in asset A versus 2,000 Rand in asset B. So the return on the portfolio will be largely determined by asset A's return because most of your investment is in asset A. Your total portfolio has an investment which is equal to 102,000 Rand. But of that 102,000 Rand, 100,000 Rand is from one asset and only 2,000 Rand is from the other asset. So the return of your portfolio will be closer to the highly invested assets return of 15% than it would be to the 100% in asset B because asset B only has an investment of 2,000 Rand. So the expected return of the portfolio is the sum of the weighted returns. How do you weight a return? This 15% return in asset A is weighted by how much is invested in asset A as a proportion of what the entire investment is, which is 102,000 Rand, multiplied by the return of asset A. We add to this the proportion of the portfolio invested in asset B multiplied by the return of asset B. This gives us a total expected return of the portfolio of 16.67%. So here we've got three different ways of calculating the expected return. First instance, we calculated what's known as a simple average. That was because the likelihood of occurrence of each outcome was equal. So we could just take the different outcomes and divide it by the number of outcomes in order to work out the simple average. This is the expected return. We can do this both with absolute numbers like we did here or with percentages. In the second situation, the likelihood of occurrence is no longer the same. So to calculate the expected return, we weight each return by the likelihood of occurrence of that particular return. We add them up, and this gives us the weighted average, which is the expected return. In the third situation, we don't have the likelihood of occurrence like we did in the second situation. But what we do have is the values or the investments into each kind of asset. So now how we go about weighting the returns is by taking each asset's investment value and dividing it by the total investment in the portfolio. The weight of that asset is multiplied by the return of that asset, and therefore the weighted returns of all assets are added together in order to give you, again, a weighted average, but just calculated differently. So how you calculate the expected return will be dependent on what the information provided to you is. That said, regardless of the information provided to you, you can always just calculate the expected return by summing up or adding up the weighted returns of each asset or the weighted returns of each outcome.